This week, the CFL came out with a press release announcing that a number of changes are going to happen this year if there's a season, but top of the list is a change to the Grey Cup. No longer, at least for this year, will the traditional host city be named, which would have been Regina. Instead, whichever team gets to the big game and has the best record gets to host. Home field advantage. Do you like this idea or do you dislike this idea? Let's dive down that rabbit hole. Given a choice, would you rather have the traditional home festival planned a year in advance and decided a year or two in advance, or do you like the CFL's new proposal to say let the best team host the game? Right around the hoop really quickly, yes or no? New idea, old idea? Bubba?
New idea, thumbs up.
Rick?
I'm a traditionalist. I'm sticking with the old.
Steve?
I'm a practical guy and a traditionalist. Yes for this year, no forever.
All right, Bubba, let's go to you. You like this idea. Why do you like this idea as a choice?
Here's one of the things that I always think about when we talk about the Grey Cup, and really we've been kind of fortunate over the last couple of years, but every year we're talking about ticket sales of the Grey Cup. I'll tell you this, if the home team of the Grey Cup were to host every single year, we would not be talking about tickets sold, unless it's in Toronto. But I still think in Toronto, they would still sell out. They can put in 25,000 people. So that eliminates the thought of that. And I think in a 9-team league, I think that's okay. If it was the NFL, I totally get it. But I like seeing rabid fans and, of course, fans that would always travel to still see their team probably as much as what we would see in a neutral site.
All right, Rick, take the traditional argument. Why is Bubba wrong?
Well, listen, we don't want to see the Grey Cup in Calgary every year. That would have been a fact over the last, 10 plus years or so. And to the NFL's credit, there are many more teams in the National Football League, but the Super Bowl under the same format would be in New England pretty much every year. So let's spread it around. Let's give that economic oomph to every city in the Canadian Football League. I know Hamilton hasn't had it since '96. But being a traditionalist, I like it spread around. The halftime show is much more conducive to having a location that is already predetermined. So, yes, let's stick with the old.
All right, Steve, you've drawn the line down the middle. Yes for this year, no no typically.
I thought it was a great compromise.
Who are you believing more out of these two?
Oh, Rick, and by far, sorry, Bubba, you're out to lunch on this, but you can't do it. The logistics wouldn't plan it. People come to this game. You would lose the sort of national sense of what it is, a celebration. The CFL is the Grey Cup, and they count backwards from there. CFL is the Grey Cup, and you need time to plan. That's why they took it out of, and it's a moneymaker, as Rick says, for the local, and that's why the halftime shows are good. People have to have, especially now, when we come back from this pandemic, you're going to have to plan your airplane flights a long way in advance because they're going to be a lot more expensive if you want to go. So it's going to take some planning. There's some spontaneous buys, and here's the other thing. Practically, I've been at a Grey Cup where a rabid city hosts it, and that was in 2013 in Regina, and it sucked. It was great in a lot of ways, but it sucked overall to be in that stadium because there was no.
Wait a second. Did it suck because you're from Hamilton and
no? Because there was no
home team. The folks in Regina didn't think it sucked.
Yeah, for them it didn't, but it did in some way because you were from Hamilton. Because Hamilton people couldn't get in, right? People from Calgary couldn't get in. There was nowhere to stay in the town because the locals all came back. The diaspora all came back. It was a fantastic thing for Regina. It was crap for the rest of the league. And I'll tell you, the commissioner at the time was extremely angry about that. He's no longer the commissioner, but he was really angry about that one aspect.
But Steve, isn't that on the flip side? There's a couple of things you said that you could argue the flip side. First of all, the flights about getting around. All right, so if you win, if you have the best record, if your team is the best, you are going to have now a massive advantage because the other team can't get in. Look, the Ottawa Senators have tried this forever. It never works because they can't fill their own building. But if you can fill your stadium with your rabid fans, why not say, hey, you had the best season, you get the benefit?
Look,
Absolutely.
Where there's a problem with attendance, there'll be a problem with attendance almost like as Bob said, it would be, if it was Toronto, there'd be a problem there anyways. And at this point in time, Vancouver too. Maybe not. I mean, we hope they come back because I think there's a real core of fans there. So I don't think there's really a CFL or an attendance problem. And you've pointed out a couple times in your columns, Radley, one of the biggest problems has been a price point. And so planning becomes a much bigger thing in all of this. So there's a, I mean, it's great for this year. You're not going to take away what would have been a massively, probably the most lucrative Grey Cup in the last 10 years. You're going to take away from Saskatchewan because obviously they couldn't fill the building this year. So you're not going to say to them, oh, you have it, and then you don't get it again for 8 years. You crazy?
Well, how come it seems to work, guys? It seems to work in the MLS. I mean, we saw some outstanding finals in Toronto. We saw a crazy final in Seattle where the home team actually got to host these games.
Don't confuse the game with the festival. Don't confuse the game with the event.
Well, I'm thinking about the game, and I'm talking about an atmosphere. And Steve, you and I were both out in Calgary this year for the Grey Cup, and you would have to admit there was a neutral hum with the crowd because, yes, you had some Ticat fans, you have fans of the CFL, and fans of the Winnipeg Blue Bombers who actually, I guess, outnumbered the Ticat fans, obviously because of distance, I'm presuming. And you look at this as Super Bowls as well, too. There's a neutral hum in the stadium because you don't have that. We talk about rabid cheering. We talk about atmosphere. It lacks, I think, because it's a neutral hum.
Even if you're right, which I don't think you are, I think the people warmed up during the game. But I think you're right the way it started and that thing because they're disappointed. They're a week away from disappointment. Their own team didn't get it. So I think that's 25,000 people or 30,000 people. You're talking like the other 2 or 3 million that are watching it on TV. They don't feel that. You don't feel that when you watch a Super Bowl. I don't think like, whoa. They're not cheering.
Rick, wouldn't the home game idea allow an awful lot of people who would never be able to get tickets otherwise because they're sold out years in advance and they're expensive, but now it's a week before, nobody can get there. Wouldn't this allow thousands of fans of the home team who otherwise could not go to a Grey Cup a chance?
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, think of those fans in Montreal or here in Hamilton or in Ottawa specifically. I'm focusing on the East because, yeah, it is a trek if you have to go all the way to BC or Edmonton or Calgary, whatever the case is. But from a competitive standpoint, having or hosting the Grey Cup, if you are the best team in the league and you happen to make it to the final, competitively, it makes all the sense in the world. We see it in the NBA and the National Hockey League and Major League Baseball to an extent because of the All-Star Game aspect of, whoever wins the All-Star Game, that league hosts has home field advantage for the World Series. But from a competitive standpoint, if you're the best team in the league, you should have the right to host the championship final. It happens to be the East or West final in this case. I like the fact that have a central location, you move it around to the league. The halftime show is such a big part of this too, as is the festival, because it's a week-long event now. There's so many events, side events, sub-events tied to the festival in and of itself. And that halftime show is something that we talk about. The pregame show, whether it's concerts or the national anthem, is a buzz that is spread across this country. That's an important aspect of the Grey Cup. Now, if you move it around from city to city, and whichever team is the best gets to host the game, maybe you can predetermine, hey, there's a band from each city that's going to compete for the Grey Cup band of the night or whatever the case is. You can work it out that way, but I think having a predetermined location, having a marquee event as your halftime show is for the league as a talking point on social media and amongst fans is a huge part of the process.
Steve mentioned the economic boost that's important to the teams, and that there's no question that this is a huge economic driver for a lot of teams. If they get a game, they make a lot of money. That, to me, is another reason why you do it this new way rather than the traditional way. We've seen now for years that the teams in the East have generally been awful, a lot of them, and the teams in the West have been strong. The East has been crossed over numerous times. You suddenly make it so that if you have a good team, you could host the Grey Cup and make a lot of money. I bet you any money the pressure and the drive to make those Eastern teams better and more competitive because you can now benefit directly if you're the ownership. I'm betting you don't see the crossover nearly as much because there's way more incentive to try and be good.
Well, I think that's crap. I think that's total crap. Sorry, guys. You can tell, this is something here. First of all, they have that incentive already, and that's to get a home playoff game. Right. So if incentive was the thing, this isn't about incentive to be good. This is about a history of DNA bad management in certain teams over the years. And looks what happens when you get good management. Suddenly you get the Tiger Cats and you get the Ottawa Red Blacks. That's what happens when you get consistently good. You get that type of thing. So it's really not that, that's the old Toronto Maple Leaf argument. And I get that, they were never impelled to be that good. Look, we got to look at this thing as in light of the discussions that were held this week about the very thin ice economically that the CFL walks upon. And if you take away the ancillary part of the Grey Cup, which is by far the biggest contributor of economic driving compared to gate, then you're going to take away I'm not talking about ancillary type thing, all the hotels and all of those things that are used, all of the economic impact, plus what happens for the league. You would be really, really hurting the CFL overall. You'd get maybe a little more, but you wouldn't be able to charge as much for tickets because it's spontaneous.
Steve, you just talked about good management. Okay, so Ottawa and Hamilton have come up with good management, put good teams in place, and have good teams on the field.
Yeah.
Between the two of them, in the last 20 years, how many Grey Cups have they hosted? How has that benefited them financially in the way that it could have if they had done well and been able to host that game? They would have benefited far more financially.
Well, for the first part, in the first way, it would have just been a game. Hamilton wouldn't have been ready. The reason Hamilton didn't get Grey Cups is because they weren't ready to host the format. And so I'll give you that, but I'd say, so what? You're getting just another game, right? In a good
It's a big
season,
game.
You're getting
It's a lucrative game.
Very much so. Let me jump in here, and I understand
Yeah.
I understand your point, Scott, in terms of forcing teams to be better. Let's face it, the crossover has been in existence in the CFL since 1996. There have been 0 teams in the East that have crossed over, so the incentive has been there for the better part of 2 decades, and it hasn't forced teams to be better. From a Grey Cup standpoint, if you're going to try and force teams to be better because they have the right to host, or they can at any point, any season, host the Grey Cup, it would only work economically if there was a revenue sharing component to that. So if Calgary or Saskatchewan hosted multiple Grey Cups in a row, or it was dominated in the West, the revenue generated from those Grey Cups would have to be shared across the league, because cities like Hamilton, Ottawa, Montreal, Toronto, BC, whatever the case is, would need to dive into that money pool.
Well, what's one of the biggest fears that if I'm running Hamilton Grey Cup 2021, what's one of the biggest fears that I would have other than ticket sales?
Pandemic is still on.
And absolutely. And, one of the biggest fears obviously is ticket sales. And I think in direct relation to that is the matchup. I mean, I'm sorry, no offense to these cities, but if I'm running Hamilton's Grey Cup 2021, the last thing I want is the BC Lions versus the Montreal Alouettes.
You want Hamilton.
You can't sell those games to the general fans, because I think at the core of this, and I think Scott Milty, you brought up the Toronto Maple Leafs argument, is that fans are fans of their own team. And if the Tiger Cats are not involved, and it's a BC versus Hamilton or BC versus Montreal matchup, which could look great on paper because of many things about the teams, at the end of the day, when you're trying to sell to not the hardcore CFL fan, but just the regular football fan out there, the regular sports fan, they're not interested. And
I think on paper that's probably true as an argument, but I don't think it faces the reality of what they're doing down at Tim Horton Field. And when the whole thing started and it was long before the Grey Cup, how they've worked the Tiger Cats is trying to make it so that you'll go no matter, independent of the team record. Now they've been pretty good ever since they moved into Tim Hortons Field, fairly good, and really good last year, and really good a couple other years. So that helps. But you're trying to make it independent. That's what this Grey Cup will be, the whole social experience, all of those kinds of things. Those tickets will be sold long before we know who the matchup is. Now, a lot of people may not go about it. They may try to get rid of those tickets once they have them, but they'll have bought them. I can guarantee it.
Let me throw one other thing.
That's why they have a smaller stadium, by the way, law of supply and demand.
Let me throw one other thing out there. We have heard for decades now, all of you have used this line, I've used this line, the CFL season begins on Labor Day. And the reason is because you got 9 teams, you got 18 games. Theoretically, you could start the season winless before Labor Day and getting your. That's probably unlikely, but you could have a terrible start to the year and still make the playoffs and still go to the Grey Cup game. if you now made it that the team with the best record got the Grey Cup, would that not make the earlier games at the start of the year when you still want to win, but they're not that important, would that not make those games far more important? Because you could screw up your whole Grey Cup hosting opportunity if you start 0-3 or 0-4, even if you get hot later.
I agree with that. That's a point. It's absolutely no reason to screw up a whole league. Come on, it's just one little point.
Well, I don't think it would screw up the league. I think it would improve.
Well, I do, and you're right about that, because the Ticats were 0-8. What, 3 years ago, or 1 win away from making the playoffs. And once you make the playoffs, you just got to win a couple, right?
That's right.
And you're in the Grey Cup. But and that makes some sense on paper if you're looking at leagues that are strong and haven't got a cultural thing and don't have. Look, the only people that really have this sort of the NFL's got it a little bit, the former AFL versus the former stand, but that's gone by the wayside. Major League Baseball still has it, right? They still have that thing. But really, the Grey Cup as a cultural institution, East-West, all of that kind of thing, goes all the way back. And you got to spread this thing around. If you don't, you'll actually hurt the franchises that'll never, ever get in there, because they'll never get a chance to see what it is that really sells about this league. That happened in Toronto at the 100th. A lot of people went, Now, they didn't follow up very well on that. And it's partly because who owned the team and the kind of money that was put into it the following year. But it happened in Montreal. When they hosted their first Grey Cup in many, many years, people went, whoa, I see.
But Steve, if you were a franchise that was never going to get in, why are we rewarding you with a Grey Cup? That should be a thing where if you're
you're rewarding the city.
Yourself good enough, you don't get to host one.
It's a city. Not the
thing side too is, you start 0-5, 0-6, 1-7, you still have a chance to make the playoffs.
Right.
And I think that keeps the fan base at least semi-interested, knowing that there is still a chance. Obviously, the closer you get to Labor Day and after Labor Day, it's much tougher to get in because of the slow start. But by Labor Day that you're not going to host the Grey Cup if we're playing under this current format. And as a city and as a community and as a team, obviously that's not going to feel too well. And that may spur some franchises to be better. But the fact of the matter is, I think at least it entices the fan base to say, yeah, we can still do this thing, even though that, the odds are stacked against them.
Bubba O'Neill, final word to you.
I would say that the CFL have been overall playing both sides of this coin of what we're discussing here. We talk about culture, the cultural institution of the Grey Cup. Well, if that was the case, why hasn't the Grey Cup truly been shared by all of its 9 cities? I feel like it's in the same cities in the last couple of years. I mean, it's been in Alberta for 3 of the last 4 years?
And Toronto a lot for the last few years. I mean, not in the last couple, but we are going to leave it with you. Do you like the new system? Would you like to see this be the norm, that the best team gets the Grey Cup? Or do you like the tradition where it is named and it goes to a city and there's a party in a week and a whole festival? We'd love to hear from you. Our Twitter accounts are on the screen. You can contact us there. They're coming up afterwards as well. Send us notes. You can find our emails online. What do you think? By the way, subscribe down below to the Home Games show here. Hit notifications so you'll get notified as well. We love to do this. We would love for you to follow us. We will talk to you soon.